Welcome to test, ladies and gentlemen. Appreciate you guys very much stopping by. So I have the round one game for you between Alireza Firouzja and Wesley. So for all my people in the Philippines, mabuhay, kamusta na? Maraming salamat po sa nanonood ng aking mga video. Appreciate it very much. Anybody who is coming from Iran, I say salam to you and khayli mamnoon. Appreciate you guys very much for stopping by and taking a look at my stuff. So for those of you that are not familiar with my layout, might be new, what I do is I put a big flag of the country that the players are representing. As you guys are probably familiar, Alireza Firouzja represents FIDE, and Wesley still represents the United States. But Alireza Firouzja is originally from Iran, so I put a little small Iranian flag down there, you know, just so you can kind of know where he came from. Same thing with Wesley. So it took a while for somebody to actually mention this. Like, I put it in a while back and I was waiting for somebody like, man, when is somebody going to say something? Somebody finally said something. So I'm not sure how many people actually noticed it, but I put a little Philippines flag down there. Yeah, just a little extra information for the players and stuff like that. So anyway, if you guys are ready to go, this is one of the most roller coaster games I've seen that I presented myself. It's kind of crazy. So if you guys are ready to go, let's take a look. So we got E4, E5. I'm gonna kind of run through the moves a little faster because there are like 70 moves. So I'm gonna try to, get through the game for you without keeping you here for 30 minutes. We got knight coming to F3, knight to C6, bishop to C4, bishop to C5. We got C3, knight comes to F6. We got D3, and so after D3, we do have the Juco Pianissimo, so the very quiet game. But as I told you guys, this game is like nowhere near quiet at all. It's like the most unquiet game. So we got D6, bishop to G5. We got H6. Bishop comes back to H4. We got A6, A4. Bishop to A7. We see castles by white. Queen to E7. Knight B to D2. We see G5. Bishop coming back to G3. We got knight to H7, and then we have B4. And something I'll mention about the position is it's very, very good for white right now. What you guys will notice, white is almost entirely developed. All they really need to do is move their queen. All of their pieces are in action. They have a nice like clump of pawns and stuff, like, commanding a lot of space. Black, it's not losing at all, but, black is in a defensive position. They don't have their bishop developed. The rook is not developed. These pieces are, the knight and the bishop are put like in kind of weird spots. They're not castled. So, black's position looks a lot different from white's position, but it's not the end of the world. And you never know what the income is, the outcome is going to be. So we see knight back to F8. We see D4. Knight comes to G6. We see B5. And then we see the novelty of the game, which is knight to A5. We actually saw 2 years ago in 2019, we actually saw knight to D8. And that's the only time that was played. That was a game between Perez and Grischuk in, like I said, 2019. So knight to A5 is a brand new move as of today. We see H3, H5, bishop coming to D5. We see bishop to B6. We got queen to B1, and we have G4. And this is kind of the point in the game where, like, the tide starts to turn a little bit. Like, black starts to kind of grab the initiative a little bit. They've improved their position somewhat, but the main issue is the fact that they're going to try to start opening some lines. This rook is going to become relevant. This bishop is kind of bearing down. So between these four pieces here, they're actually starting to produce a nice little attack for black here. Pawn takes G4, pawn takes G4, then we got knight down to H2. And as you guys can see, there's a big drastic difference in the placement of white's pieces. They're pretty much just purely just serving defensive roles. We got queen down to G5. We see queen to D3. Queen to D3 is really one of the only saving moves in the position for Firouzja. Knight comes to F4. And then we see queen to E3. Just kind of like, placing a pin at the moment for this queen on G5. We see queen to H6. Now, in this position, we definitely, it's not against the rules, but we definitely don't want to take. Because you're going to see queen taking, and then it's like, man, you're looking at checkmate right here. So you're going to be having to cover with the queen. You're going to be dropping your knight. So that's not where we want to be. So after knight comes to H4, like I said, queen to E3, queen backs up to H6, make sure it's defended. We see rook F to E1, just trying to give the king a little bit of room to breathe. We see F6, bishop to C4. We see knight to H5. We got knight H to F1. We have bishop to d7, bishop to h4. We see knight coming back down to f4. Then we see g3. And I think this is a really interesting like piece setup because like this bishop is held by this pawn and it's also attacking this knight, but you don't want to drop this bishop. So it's kind of like a Zuzwang position for both players, like, you know, as far as those pieces are concerned. So we see queen to h5. We see pawn takes a6, pawn takes a6, bishop to d5. Knight, rook comes to b8. We see pawn takes f4 now. Queen takes h4, and then we see knight to g3. So as you guys can see, like white has pretty much managed to like save their position and just make defensive moves like just in time. So, you know, there's no checkmates down here. Of course, you could check here, but the king's just going to scoot over and you're good to go. So we see bishop back to a7. We see knight d to f1. Now, backing up just one move here. Something that you do want to think about when you're playing your game is if you have the opportunity to try to push your opponent back some, you know, try to take advantage of it. So in this position, instead of bishop to a7, which, you know, kind of does clear room for the rook, but, you know, one of these rooks can swing over and just contest the file, so you're not doing that much. c6, backing this bishop up, because this bishop is really, really nicely placed. And then backing it up to c4. It's just a slight difference in the placement of the bishop, but as you can see, like, it's just doing a little bit more. And then after king coming to d8, king to f1, and you're in just maybe a little bit better position. But like I said, we did see knight d to f1, so just add an extra defense. We see king to e7, and then I think this is a very, very interesting point in the game because realizing if you move this knight, there is checkmate here on h1. I think this is like in this particular position, this is really, really nice calculation and seeing, you know, a few moves deep for Firouzja, even though, you know, of course, he's like one of the best in the world. So it's not surprising, but I just think this is really interesting, like this combination that comes up. We see pawn takes e5, pawn takes e5, knight comes to f5 with check, which initially seems like, okay, if it doesn't work out, you're going to get mated here on h1. Bishop takes f5 because you do have a fork going on the king and the queen, so you have to take here. And then after the pawn takes, as you guys can see, it opens it up just in time for this bishop to protect h1. So now you have this point and this point both protected. So I just think that's really just interesting that, you know, Firouzja was able to produce a combination like that. It's nice. So we see c6 now backing the bishop up. The bishop comes back to g2. We see knight to c4. We see queen to d3. d5, you know, kind of cementing that knight in the center right there. But Firouzja has different plans. He is like a very sacrificial rook player from what I've seen. So we see rook takes e5 with check. And it might look kind of suspect at first, but we do see knight taking e5. And then we see rook taking e1. And this is the point of the game that I would like for you guys to pause the video and try to figure out what black plays in the game, and then also what was like a killer move for black to play. And I'll show you the difference between these two moves here in a minute. Okay, cool. So what we actually saw in the game, so congratulations if you guessed king to f7. The unfortunate thing about king to f7 is it pretty much makes the game. So in the position that we see before, in this particular position, black is probably up about 2 pawns worth positionally. So it's like, I mean, they can definitely like push that in for a win. But king to f7 actually like makes the game like almost dead even. Like I said, I'll be showing you that in a second here. But one of the killer moves, and it seems kind of counterintuitive, I think, because of the fact that it seems like it just kind of undoes your position some, is actually king to d8. And that might seem weird because you're thinking, man, I'm like blocking my rooks now. Like I'll put my king on the back rank. It doesn't look like, you know, very appetizing, right? But I will show you what happened in the game and what could have happened. And then I'll also come back and show you queen to d7. So we have king to f7. The problem with king to f7 is after rook takes e5, you can put the rook down on b2. Rook is going to come back down to e2. Rook up to b6. But you have some issues with once you do push this pawn to try to give your, you know, queen a little bit of movability. This queen coming back to capture, or this king coming up, is gonna be there's gonna be some issues after rook to e5, especially if you push this pawn like we see in the game f6. If you were to take with the queen, you're gonna be looking at, you know, rook to e5 situations, and as you guys can see, this rook is going to be swinging over and it's going to be pinning this queen to this king. So the main issue is the defense of your king and the proximity of your king and your queen together. So if we back up after rook to e1, if we saw king to d8, as you guys will be able to see, like this is not going to be relevant because the queen has a lot more room to move around. So we see rook taking e5, rook to b6, just defending the pawns over there. We see f6, and then after queen takes f6, we can see rook to f5, queen coming to e6, rook back to e5. But as you guys can see, the queen can pretty much move wherever it wants to, like, you know, anywhere. And so, you know, you're looking at a much more dominant position because especially you are up an entire rook at this point. But we didn't see that. Like I said, we did see king to f7. We saw rook taking e5, rook to b2, rook down to e2, and then we saw rook back up to b6. We saw f6 and then bishop back to b8. And as you guys can see, this bishop is like on a really, really nice diagonal. This queen is all coming down. This rook is coming down. So, I mean, it's looking pretty nice for black here in this one. So we see queen coming to f5. We see bishop to h2 with check. Knight takes h2. Queen takes h2. And then we see king over to f1. Of course, only move. And we actually saw rook to b7 in the game. And this is actually, it can actually be considered to be a blunder. But the only thing about the situation is the fact that, like, it's to find the alternate move in the position. You actually have to calculate a queen sacrifice, which isn't always the easiest to do. So instead of rook to b7, which is a blunder, you actually would be going rook to b1. And then after queen takes b1, queen down to h1 with check, bishop takes h1, king, rook takes h1 with check, king to g2, rook takes b1, rook up to e8, or rook up to e7, and then king takes here. And as you guys can see, it's a much more even game. This king is a little bit superior to this king because it's a little bit more central. So, you know, you have a little bit more play here as black. But after we saw rook to b7, like I said, it is a blunder. Go ahead and try to figure out the win. It's like a complete, just overwhelming win for white in this position. Go ahead and try to find it. Okay, cool. So, like, if you guys are familiar with like doing tactical puzzles, or when you're like starting out and you're like getting trained to like kind of like where your candidate moves are and what kind of moves you should look for in a game, usually you look for like checks and captures and forcing moves and stuff like that, right? Well, one of those forcing moves in this position is actually queen to e6 with queen to e6 with check, this is just like gonna completely crumble you know, black's position. King is going to be forced to come to g6. You're going to be taking on g4 with check. You're going to see king to h6. Rook is going to come to e5. And as you can see, black's position is looking very, very tender. There's really not a lot you can do to prevent rook from swinging over to g5. You're going to see a rook down to b1 with check. King comes to e2. Rook to b7. And then rook to g5. This is just a sample variation. I mean, there's like 6 or 7 different variations you can follow, but as you guys can see, this is very, very suffocating for black, and this is just completely won. So going back to what we saw after rook came to b7, this is actually a nice idea. It's still winning. It's still good. What we saw in the game was bishop takes d5 with check. And this is a very interesting move. It's taking advantage of the fact this rook is undefended over here, and you have the ability to kind of check here. So pawn takes d5, queen takes d5. You see king to g6, queen to e4 with check, king takes f6, queen to c6 with check. We see king to g5, and then we actually see rook to e5 with check. And this is actually a premature rook movement. What you really, really needed to do in this position is actually check on d5 one more time with the queen. And then after queen to d5 with check, king would come down to h4, and then you would actually see queen taking b7. And the major thing is the queen is holding this h1 square, so there's no checkmates. And as you guys can see, you're just up 4 pawns to 2, and there's just really not a way to win this as black. So going back to what we had in the game, we did see rook to e5, and so Wesley so decides he's going to go ahead and trade his queen off, taking on e5, and then pawn taking e5. We see rook over to f7. We see e6, rook to f6, queen coming to d7, rook h to f8. If ever you have a situation where you're having 2 rooks against a queen, you always want to try to make sure you're coordinating your rooks together. You do not ever want to leave one rook, you know, you don't ever want to leave your rooks by themselves because, you know, the queen is like an expert forker. So you don't want to get forked and give up one of your rooks, because then you're going to have a rook against the queen, and that's not good. So we see queen over to g7 with check. Then we see king down to h4. Now, I'm going to go show you a different variation here, but the thing that you want to be doing in this position is actually pushing the king up and not pushing the king down, because it is allowing the king to like defend this pawn. So if we go back to rook h to f8, queen to d2 was a much more you know, killer move. After king came to g6, we see queen to d3 with check, king to g7, queen to d7 with check, king to g8, then we see e7 there. We allow the check on f2, king sidesteps to g1, we see rook to f1 with check, king to g2, rook 1 f2 check, king to g3, excuse me, rook 2 f3 check, king takes g4, rook 3 f4 check, king to g5, rook 8 f5 check, and then you're going to sacrifice the queen and you're going to get yourself into a winning endgame. Queen takes f5, rook takes f5 with check, king takes f5, king to f7, and not moving immediately, but making it to where you can take the opposition. So you would actually queen the pawn first, forcing the king up to e8, and then you would be taking the opposition on e6, and this is a favorable opposition because you're going to go all the way down and collect this pawn, and you have split pawns, and anybody who has studied, you know, some basic end games understands how to, you know, promote, you know, how your split pawns one file apart are going to work. So coming back, like I said, we saw king to h4. We saw e7. Rook takes on f2. And then the problem is, like I said, now you don't have the ability to sidestep and walk up like this. So it's going to be a little bit harder for you. King comes to e1. Rook to f1 with check. We see king to e2. Rook 1 to f2 with check. We see king to e3. Rook 2 to f3 with check. King to e4. Rook comes to e8. We see queen to h6 with check. King coming to g3. We see queen to d6 with check. Rook to f2. We see queen to d2 with check, king to g3, rook to d6 with check, king to h3. We see queen to d7. And it seems like maybe the rook can't be defended, but you do see rook f to f8. And that is one of the other problems with the current variation is now you are pinned on this file. So you cannot actually capture this rook yet. So we got c4, king to h4, we see king to d5, rook to g8, we see king to e6, and then we see g3. And as you guys can see, this pawn is running away. And there is really not much else for you to do in this position but start to just play some checks. We see queen to d4 with check, king to h3, queen to e3, pinning the pawn. We see king to h2. We see queen to h6 with check, king coming down to g1, queen to e3 with check, king to h2, queen to h6 with check, king to g1, and then we see queen to e3 with check, and then we do have a draw by threefold repetition. So like I said, it's a situation where you you can't allow this pawn to promote. So even though you have a queen, you don't really have a good way to push your pawn home. And so you are forced to draw this game. And I think they, like I said, it was crazy because as you guys saw, both players literally had chances to win the game. They both had like completely decisive positions. And it's just insane for the games to be like, you know, going up and down like they did. But like I said, this was a 72 move game. So I tried to keep the video as short as possible. But I mean, with as crazy as the game was, it was kind of tough. So this is one of my longest videos I've done in a while. But to get these good mornings going, maayong buntag, mayad na agahan, nainbag na bigat, masentos ya kabasan, marhe na aga, buenos dias, maayong aga, see, mapia na uma, kapian kapunu dios, mayap a abak, mayad na aga, let me see, mapia agay, mapia kapapita. We got my big abukla, and there is, what's the next one? I think it's Marja na buntag. Marja na buntag, and Marja mainat maupai na aga, and kasan yangan si lub. Man, and khayli mamnoon for people that are coming from Iran. Appreciate you sticking with me for this entire video. For those of you that did, and I'll promise you that I will really try hard not to make a video this long in the future. I do not like to go 19 minutes, but every single game is different. So I appreciate you guys very much, and I'll see y'all next time.